Greetings and welcome to Daniel chapter 8. This is lesson 11 in this series. I've entitled the lesson Broken Without Hands. If you're familiar with the text, you know why, and if not, you'll understand soon enough. So Daniel chapter 8, sort of a quick story and to set the background for our text today. In 175 BC, a man named Antiochus or Antiochus IV ascended the throne of the Seleucid Empire. If you remember, this was one of the empires that formed following the death of Alexander the Great when his kingdom was divided between his four generals. The picture you see here is how the kingdoms were originally divided between the four generals, and you can see the Seleucid Empire, the largest landmass-wise of all the empires. And from this point, the Seleucid Empire slowly expanded and captured Lebanon and Israel. And this happened in a series of campaigns between 235 BC and 198 BC. So when Antiochus comes on the scene in 175 BC, when he ascends the throne, Israel is already under his rule. So if you're trying to place all this in your mind, Daniel is writing around 550 BC. It's currently, as we talk about Antiochus, it's 175 BC, so about 375 years in Daniel's future. The things that he's writing about are almost 400 years away. During what we call the intertestamental period between the Old and the New Testaments. Again, we hear it referred to as the silent years, and indeed God was silent, but he was not inactive. In fact, he was very active. He's always active in the lives of his believers and the lives of his children. He's always busy in our world doing his will. And that was the case here. Although he was quiet as far as speaking to his people, he was very active. So again, as King Antiochus IV comes on the scene, and by the way, that wasn't his real name. He took that name to himself. He also appended a title to his name, and that's Epiphanes. Now, Epiphanes, literally in the Greek, means God manifested or glorious one manifested. It's this idea of manifested. So he billed himself as the manifestation of God. In fact, on the back of some of the coins that he had minted, it actually said that. Antiochus, Theos, God manifested. So no self-image problem with this guy. Now, initially upon coming to power, it appears that he didn't have a lot of interest in the Jewish nation and in Israel and in Jerusalem other than the continued Hellenization of his entire empire. So other than his empire adopting Greek practices, Greek ideas, Hellenization, that was his biggest concern. Now, this is going to change radically. He is going to persecute the Jews. He's going to turn an angry hand, a wicked hand against the Jews. And many of the Jews, in a wordplay, referred to him no longer as Antiochus Epiphanes, but Epimanes. Now, Epimanes is the Greek word for madman. So he was Antiochus the madman. Now, they didn't call him that because he was angry. He may have been, but because he was crazy. He was a butcher. He was evil. He was a madman. Now, immediately upon assuming power, Antiochus IV decided to pursue the conquest of Egypt, which no other Seleucid king had been able to accomplish. So keep in mind, Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies. Already the Seleucid Empire had annexed Lebanon and Israel, and he wanted to take over Egypt. Now, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, the Roman Empire at this point was starting to expand and advance, and Antiochus, historians tell us, believed if he could conquer and annex Egypt, that would increase his kingdom size, absolutely, and their power, and would decrease the possibility of Rome attacking, or if they did, increase the possibility, because of his larger armies, that he could resist them and even defeat them. So that really sets the stage for our background today. Now, as you think about where this is happening, as you look at this timeline that comes from the study of Nehemiah, so this is 550 BC, right? So this is where we are, roughly speaking, in the third year of Belshazzar. You can see we're about 11 years away from Cyrus issuing the decree to rebuild the temple. We're just a few years away from the rebuilding of the temple in 516 even being completed. So this gives you an idea of where we are on the timeline. Keep in mind, Daniel and his friends went into captivity in 605, the first deportation. Ezekiel went in the second deportation in 597. And then finally, Jerusalem fell in 586. But we're here in 550-ish, third-year reign of Belshazzar. And again, we're coming up on some major eschatological events for the nation of Israel, Old Testament events, in the restoration and them being brought back to the land, in the temple being completed, and ultimately the wall being completed under Nehemiah. So that's sort of where we are as we get ready to launch into Daniel chapter 8, lesson 11. Now, by way of reminder, Daniel 8 reverts back to Hebrew, the language of the Jews. So the book will remain in Hebrew from this point on. So last week we finished looking at Daniel 7, and in particular the vision that Daniel had during the first year of the reign of Belshazzar. We saw a little horn that came out of the fourth empire, the Roman Empire. We identified who that little horn probably was historically. And then we also said that that little horn served as a type of the coming Antichrist, a second fulfillment, a grander fulfillment of the coming Antichrist, the man of sin, the son of perdition. But we did identify who that person probably was in history. By the way, great disagreement among scholars on who that person was. Today we'll come to a totally different scenario. Today we come to another little horn, but this little horn comes not out of the Roman Empire, but out of the Grecian Empire, the third empire. So this little horn is wicked. This little horn is going to be shockingly similar to the little horn in Daniel 7, but this little horn emerges out of the Grecian Empire, to be more specific, out of the Seleucid Empire. Now, I've been using the term dual fulfillment, and I think it's a good term. I'm currently reading a commentary on the book of the Revelation, and the author described the phenomena like this, quote, "This brings us to a characteristic of Old Testament prophecy, which is also characteristic of the Revelation, and which solves this problem of distance and relevance. As we've just pointed out, the prophets had two foci in prophetic perspective: the events of the present and the immediate future, and the ultimate eschatological event." So what, and that's George Eldon Ladd. So what George Ladd is saying here is that many of these prophecies, whether the prophet knew it or not, and they probably didn't, had two foci points. One that was in the present or immediate future, tight in, a lesser fulfillment, but nonetheless a fulfillment, and then one that what he called the ultimate eschatological event. I love that. I've been explaining it as the more important event, the bigger deal, but I love the idea of the ultimate eschatological event, for that's what the second one is. Now, Pastor Zach in his sermon on Daniel chapter 8 referred to this phenomena as type fulfillment, and of course that's fine. The little horn here in Daniel chapter 8, Antiochus IV, is serving as a type of the coming Antichrist, so that works too. Now, please keep in mind, Daniel under Belshazzar is operating in the background. He's no longer in the foreground, but he remains faithful to God. Daniel's 70 years old, give or take, yet he's still faithful to God, and he's still being used by God, and that's a good lesson for you and I. And then lastly, I would just point out, like last week, I read between 10 commentators and then listened to our pastor's sermon. In the case of all 11, they agree that this is King Antiochus IV. So great agreement. And then equally many of them recognize that he's serving as a type fulfillment for the coming man of sin, the coming son of perdition. But 11 of 11 nail this to the same person historically. Now, rarely in the last 6 chapters of the book of Daniel do you come to anything with that type of consensus. So we should enjoy that for the moment. Feel comfortable that we probably know who Daniel chapter 8 is written about historically, and recognize that portions of it could be, and probably are, likely pointing forward to the ultimate little horn, the man of sin, the son of perdition, the one who opposes and exalts himself against everything that is called God. Generally with my class, I give a what's the big takeaway? What's the one takeaway? If you have to boil this down to one sentence, what is it? And you'll see this. It's Psalm 135:6. The Lord does as he pleases in heavens and earth and the seas and the great deep. Now, to some, that's very scary that our God is sovereign and does what he wants. To the believer, that is very comforting because we understand from other verses that God is always operating with our best in mind, that he's working all things together for our good because he loves us and he's called us according to his own purposes. And so if you want the big takeaway, what's the takeaway of Daniel 8? It's that our sovereign God does as he pleases. Psalm 135:6. So with all that being said, that's by way of introduction, about 10 minutes, so not too bad. And let's get into our text this afternoon now. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward, northward, southward. No beast could stand before him. There was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. So this is Daniel chapter 7 was the 1st year of Belshazzar. Daniel chapter 8 is the 3rd year of Belshazzar, so we don't know exactly what month, but this has been 2 to 3 years since chapter 7, following that vision. And you can see once Daniel understood this vision reminded him a great deal of the vision he had just had, the one that appeared to him at the first. More than likely, that's the one from chapter 7. So although years have passed after the angels sort of unpacked this to a small degree for him, it reminds him, and we'll see why, it reminds us too once we unpack it. So to fix this in your mind as you're thinking about 550 BC, as you're thinking about the Babylonian Empire, it's waning. The Medo-Persian Empire is on the rise. In fact, Cyrus has already united the Medes and Persians, although he will not take Babylon, actually his general will not take Babylon for another 11 years. But he is on the rise. Now this vision comes with a location. That's very interesting. In this case, it's Susa, which is the capital of Elam. It'll become the winter capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. Susa is also called Shushan by the Greeks. It's located about 230 miles directly east of Babylon and about 120 miles north of the Persian Gulf. And you can see he's even at a specific place. He's at the Ulai Canal. It's interesting. This is the future location of both Esther and Nehemiah, but here he's picturing himself in the winter capital of the Medo-Persian Empire, and he's not picturing himself there. He's having a vision where that's where God puts him in this vision. So very interesting that that's where it would be. And again, theologians don't believe he left Babylon. They believe that he's still in Babylon, just having this vision. So going back to verse 3, he sees a ram. This ram has 2 horns. One is higher than the other. This would remind us of the bear, that one side was higher or larger than the other, the bear that had the 3 ribs in his mouth. The larger horn, in the case of this ram, came up last. And scholars agree, and the Bible's going to tell us directly, that this is the Medo-Persian Empire of chapter 2. And so there's no disagreement there. This is the kingdom that's represented by the arms and chest of silver in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and the bear in Daniel's dream. And the larger side, or the larger horn, is the Persian Empire. Although they came up last, they were stronger and greater in number. So what he sees, and I always try to show the class things, because I like capturing these with my mind. I like seeing them in my mind. He sees this ram with a larger horn, and this ram is just doing what he wants, and nobody can stop him. He's pushing westward. He's pushing northward. This is Cyrus the Great. This is the Medo-Persian Empire, and no one can hinder its advance. It's doing as it pleases. And that brings us to verse 5. As I was considering, so he's considering this ram, and he's considering what he's doing, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and he struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he, that's the goat, cast him, that's the ram, down to the ground and trampled on him, the ram. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power, that's the goat's power. Then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn, and again, this goat had just one horn, the great horn was broken off. And instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So as Daniel is considering the vision about this goat, about the ram, a goat comes up, a male goat, and this goat travels across the ground without touching it. Now again, scholars agree that this is more than likely the Grecian Empire. This is the empire that was the brass midsection on Nebuchadnezzar's dream. This was the leopard with the 4 heads and the 4 wings in Daniel's vision. And notice this goat moves across the face of the whole earth. He moves from the west across the whole earth without touching the ground. We have the idea of speed, and I would say even the direction is significant. This is the Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great, who at the young age of 32, 33 had conquered the known world and was dead months later. The ram that had the single horn, that ram is the Grecian Empire, and that single horn is Alexander the Great. Now the good news is in Daniel 8, 20 and 21, the Bible tells us that. So although we were thinking that, it's okay. Sometimes the Bible, the good news, it just tells you, and you can read that in 8:20 and 21. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of the Media and Persia, forgive me. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. So we've nailed everything here. That's fantastic. Verse 6, the goat with the notable horn charges in his powerful wrath, and he hits the ram. Now go to Daniel in this vision. See these 2 powerful beasts collide. Hear the clash. And then see the ram with both horns broken off. See the ram with no power to stand against the goat. See the goat stomping the ram. No one could rescue the ram from the goat. And if I said the ram was stomping the goat, that's not what I meant. The goat was stomping the ram. And no one could rescue the ram from the goat. Sinclair Ferguson in his commentary said this: nothing could more eloquently summarize the overwhelming defeat Alexander visited upon the Persian forces in the battle at Granicus River in 334 BC. With only 35,000 men, Alexander's forces plunged through the river, attacking Darius's 100,000 footmen and 10,000 horsemen, reportedly killing 20,000 at a loss of only 100 Greek troops. Complete victory in a couple of battles would soon follow. Verse 8a, the male goat grew very great. Indeed he did, and very fast, we would add. Verse 8b, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So Daniel sees the goat charge the ram. He sees the goat hit the ram. He sees the goat stomp the ram. He sees the horn broken off. And he sees these 4 kingdoms grow up out of that broken horn. That's what he sees. And this is ultimately exactly what we know to be true from history. After Alexander the Great died around 32 to 33 years old, in Babylon, by the way, under very mysterious conditions, ultimately his 4 generals rise in power. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassandra. I can never say Lysimachus. And Cassandra. Again, today we'll be talking about the Seleucid Empire. We'll be talking about Antiochus IV. But these are the kingdoms, these are the horns that came up. And this just reminds us how quickly God can raise up a king or a kingdom to bring judgment on another one, and how quickly he can put it down. Now, as we look at this, this is all history. Keep in mind, when Daniel's being given this is all apocalyptic prophecy. In time, all of this is going to prove to be amazingly accurate. But at the time, no one would have known all these details. No one would have understood this. We look back and go, wow, this is amazing. And indeed, it is. And so the horn is broken off, the four horns come into their place. Now let's pause for a moment and tie all these dreams together. So I have Daniel's dream in chapter 7 in the first column. Then we have Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 in the second column. Then we have Daniel's vision in chapter 7 on the right column. So the head of gold, that's the Babylonian Empire represented by the lion with wings. Now the Medo-Persian Empire, that's the chest and arms of silver, that's the bear with the larger side, that's the ram with the larger horn. The Grecian Empire, that's the bronze midsection, that's the leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. By the way, the speed is the 4 wings, the 4 generals are the 4 heads. And then we have Alexander the Great, the Grecian Empire, represented here by the goat, who has the horn that is broken off that's replaced by 4. And then not part of our vision today is the Roman Empire, represented by the animal that could not be described with the 10 horns and the little horn that came up from among them, uprooting 3. And in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, it was the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay, or tiled clay. So that's tying together of 2, 7, and 8. But in today's vision, we're just focusing on the Medo-Persian Empire and the Grecian Empire because God needs his people to know about this wicked little horn that is coming that will seek to destroy them. And so again, hopefully this ties everything together with these visions that we've had so far from Daniel. So verse 9. Out of one of them, that's out of one of these horns, the 4, we know which one, the Seleucid Empire, out of these one of these horns, came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled them. It became great, even as great as the prince of hosts. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offerings because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering?" So he's asking a question about how long this is going to go, and the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. And then he said to me, so the question was all for Daniel, and he said to me, for 2,300 evening and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. So out of one of these 4 kingdoms comes a little horn, another king. It's out of the Seleucid Empire. We've already talked about that. This little horn is not the same as last week. Last week's little horn came out of the Roman Empire. This week's little horn comes out of the Grecian Empire. Now, I would argue, although they both fulfilled in a certain person in history, they both have a grander, a ultimate eschatological fulfillment in the final man of sin, the final son of perdition, the Antichrist. Notice this little horn grew exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land, no doubt a reference to the promised land. This is the rise of Antiochus in 175 BC, the 8th king of the Seleucid Empire. Now there's been fighting between the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. Antioch believes Egypt's going to be a real feather in his cap, and one which no other Seleucid king has been able to accomplish, so it's very attractive to him. Rome is expanding, so he goes to go against Egypt. Ultimately, Egypt allies itself with Rome, and the Seleucid Empire under Antiochus or Antiochus IV is turned back by Rome. There was no fight, just a threat of a fight, and ultimately Antiochus backs down. While this is all happening, he gets word of chaos that's breaking out in Jerusalem, because some are following one high priest, some are following another high priest, some are being Hellenized, some are resisting. And so he's been frustrated on the battlefield. This is more frustration that are coming from Israel. And so as you might imagine, he has had enough of the Jews. So he is going to return to Jerusalem, and he is in a rage. Verse 10, he grows great even to the host of heaven. Again, I want you to picture a man who's growing up against God's people, a man who's puffing up against God's people. And some of the stars he throws down to the ground and tramples them. Now, this is apocalyptic language. You should recognize that stars are people. You can remember the promise made to Abraham. Again, don't get caught up in the fact that this is apocalyptic language. These are very familiar terms for us. Now, to go back to history, when Antiochus arrives in Jerusalem, among other things, he sets up an altar to Zeus at the burnt offering in the temple. He offers a pig on that altar. He scatters pig guts and entrails all over the temple. He really profanes the temple. He slaughters a great number of Jews. In fact, we're told by Josephus that it's 40,000 over a 3-day period. He sells thousands into slavery. He begins to destroy every copy of the Jewish scriptures he can get his hands on. He makes decrees that forbid circumcision, keeping the Sabbath, or reading the Torah. And if you circumcised or kept the Sabbath, you could be killed. Here we see the rise of the little horn in the face of God. It's like this little guy shaking his fist into the face of God as he's persecuting God's people, as he's overthrowing God's law, as he's profaning and stopping temple worship. Daniel further explains in verse 11a, he became great, even as great as the prince of the host. I want you to see a man who's exalting himself in the face of God, a man who's challenging the living God, a little man who's shaking his fist in the face of Yahweh God, saying, they will not worship, they will do what I say, everything you say, I say no. Now, obviously, he didn't understand this Yahweh God. He didn't believe in this Yahweh God, but nonetheless, that's what he was doing. And we should recognize that this is in some type, a final future fulfillment of the coming Antichrist. In verse 11b, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of the sanctuary was overthrown. He stopped the daily sacrifices. So every day, 2 sacrifices, a morning and evening sacrifice, he stopped those. He overthrew the sanctuary. He defiled the sanctuary. He stopped worship. Verse 12. And the host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Now, why is all this happening? As you think about, we just got the nation of Israel back. We just got the temple rebuilt. We finally got the wall redone in troubled times. And here we are, chaos again for the nation of Israel. Well, it was because of the Hellenization that I talked about. Many were being Hellenized. Many were rejecting their Jewish roots. In fact, they had built a gymnasium in front of the temple, and many of the priests were wrestling in the gymnasium. Now, in Greek wrestling, you wrestled in the nude. What was happening is all of these Hellenization efforts were causing God's people to compromise, and God responds and he gives them over. He allows the temple he allowed to be destroyed, he allows it to be defaced, desecrated. He allows a pig to be slaughtered there. He allows the morning and evening to stop because of the sins of his people. This guy threw truth to the ground. This guy acted and prospered. This guy was really persecuting God's people. Now the story goes on that he sent out a captain or captains throughout the various towns within Israel to set up Greek gods and to demand that the Jewish people worship that idol that he established. Ultimately, the captain arrives in Modin. That's Modein if you want to Google that, Modin. Now the captain sets up an idol, and he asks for the leading priest in the city, in Modin, the town, to offer a sacrifice to that idol. So the leading priest is brought out. He's an elderly man named Matthias, and he refuses to offer a sacrifice to the idol. Now this gets a little heated between the Antiochus' captain and Matthias, with him saying, I'm not going to do it, the captain saying, you're going to do it, and ultimately this younger priest steps in. He says, no, don't worry about it, I'll do it. Don't worry about him. He's kind of like an old fuddy-duddy. He's a traditionalist. I have no problem doing this. I'm good with it. I'll do it. So the young priest gets down on his hands and knees to offer the sacrifice to the idol, and Matthias draws out his sword, runs it through the young priest, then turns and kills the captain, then cries, whoever is for God, follow me, and he leaves with his 5 sons, and many follow them. Matthias ultimately appoints his grandson, Judas Maccabeus, Judas the Hammer Maccabeus, another priest, to take over the resistance that is formed from this event. Judas leads a successful revolt against the Seleucid dynasty, ultimately cleanses the temple, ultimately reinstates the daily sacrifices, ultimately relights the menorah, and ultimately for 100 years, give or take, Israel to a small degree is an independent nation under what's known as the Hasmonean dynasty. Before that dynasty turns over to the Herodian dynasty in 37 AD, you'll remember Herod the Great as he's installed by Rome. Now, if you've not heard about this, again, go read 1st and 2nd Maccabees, go read Josephus. But to this day, the Jews celebrate the Feast of Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. The purpose of Hanukkah is to celebrate the great deliverance that occurred under Judas the Hammer Maccabee and his cleansing of the temple, his relighting of the menorah, and his reinstitution of daily sacrifices. All predicted here by Daniel hundreds of years, almost 400 before it happened. Verse 13, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? So notice the Holy One is speaking and he asks a question. How long, and it's threefold, how long will the burnt offering be stopped at morning and evening? How long for the transgression that makes desolate? How long will the sanctuary be trampled underfoot? How long is worship ceased? How long is the place laid desolate? How long is what this little horn has been allowed to do? How long does this continue? And then you can see the time frame in verse 14. For 2,300 days in the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Now this is literally 2,300, more than likely, evening and mornings. Not days, but evening and morning sacrifices. So, but for sure, it's 6.4 years or 3.2 years, 2,300 days or exactly half of that, 1,150 days, because there's 2 sacrifices a day. Now, what's interesting, if we look at these 2 time frames, the 6.4 doesn't make anything compelling, but the 3.2 does. It aligns with when Antiochus profaned the temple. That's the abomination that makes desolate. That's when he brought the image of Zeus into the temple. That is when he slayed the pig on the altar, and when Judas Maccabee purified the holy place. So 167 BC to 164 BC, a little over 3 years. In fact, we know it was the 15th day of Tishri that it started, and the 25th day of Chislev, the 12th month, that it ended. Again, that's when the 25th of December is when they celebrate Hanukkah. And that brings us to verse 15. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called to the man by him, Gabriel, make this man understand. So he, that's Gabriel, came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. So as Daniel is laboring to understand this vision, all of a sudden there stands before him one with the appearance of man. This is Gabriel. This is an angel. And he's there before Daniel. Then one calls out from between the banks of the Ulai, and he tells Gabriel to make this man understand the vision. More than likely, this is Christ. This is a Christophany. This is a pre-incarnate appearance of the true Son of Man. Daniel is a son of man in the human sense, much like Ezekiel. This is the prophetical Son of Man, Jesus, probably directing Gabriel. So verse 17, Gabriel comes near where Daniel is standing. Daniel is, of course, frightened. He falls on his face. And the angel speaks to him, understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end. Now here, Son of Man is not being used prophetically. It's being used like the 90 times or so that Ezekiel is called the Son of Man by God. Just a human being, a son of man. Not prophetically like the Son of Man who approaches the Ancient of Days. And so this idea of the vision is for the time of the end it could really mean the vision is for a time that will be fulfilled. The vision is for God's appointed time. Now, could it be referring loosely to the time of the ultimate end? Sure, but we know it's pointing to that ultimately. So he's really just saying probably this vision has a time in the end where it will be fulfilled. But again, we get that it's pointing to the final Antichrist ultimately. That's the ultimate eschatological event that it's pointing to. Verse 18, and when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand up and said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation. For it refers to the appointed time of the end. There's that same idea. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but it's not his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit, prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, he did, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, and not by human hand. Verse 26, the vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. So as Gabriel is speaking to Daniel, Daniel falls into this deep sleep with his face to the ground. Then the angel touches him and stands him up. Verse 19, behold, I will make known to you what shall be the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. So the latter end of indignation, the end of anger, the end of judgment, the conclusion of the time of wrath, for at an appointed time it shall end. That's the idea. We talked about the ram being the Medo-Persian Empire. We talked about the goat being the Grecian Empire. We talked about the great horn being Alexander the Great. We talked about the horn being broken. We talked about the 4 kingdoms arising. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, again, the idea of the transgressors reaching their limit is probably God's people, and he's about to bring judgment. A king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. This is Antiochus IV. Now let's just cull together everything God says about him. First, if we use the ESV, he's a king of bold face. New King James, that means fierce features. The ASV is fierce countenance, while the Holman is insolent. So we understand the picture there. He's a fierce king. He's an insolent king. Number 2, he understands riddles according to the ESV, sinister schemes according to the New King James, dark sentences according to the ASV. He's skilled in intrigue according to the Holman. So again, we get this second idea. He's good with sinister schemes. He's skilled at intrigue. He's like a politician. Point number 3, his power shall be great. And it was, but not by his own power. And that's true, it was not his own power. He will cause fearful or terrible destruction, and he did. I talked about 40,000 perishing in a 3-day period. For a time, he will succeed in what he does, and he did for a time. He will destroy both the powerful and the holy people. He did, that's true. By his cunning, he will cause deceit to prosper under his rule. It did. He will exalt himself in his own mind, pointing to his arrogance and his pride. Surely God manifested is one who exalts himself. Without warning, he will destroy many. He did, many Jews. He will rise up against the prince of princes. That's who he was ultimately challenging, whether he recognized it or not. And he will be broken without human hands, without effort. God will break him. The God that raised him to bring chastisement and judgment upon his people is going to just as quickly put him down like a dog because he was a hot rebel. I said this, his reign will be nasty, aggressive, abusive, vicious, but his downfall will be devastating. Verse 26, So the issue involving the evening and mornings is true. So seal it up for many days from now. Again, Antiochus ruled from 175 to 164, so about 11 years. He did do a lot of things, but he did die under suspicious conditions, not on the battlefield, just as Daniel had prophesied that he would. Now, for you and I, this is all ancient history. This is way back there. For Daniel, this is all amazing prophecy. Never forget that. No one would have known who this was or what this was about until the Seleucid Empire, until Antiochus came on the scene. Verse 27, and I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision, and I did not understand it. Well, that's very helpful. Some of the things in Ukraine I've been appalled by. So I understand. And what Daniel's talking about is this had a physiological effect on him. This had a psychological effect on him. Now keep in mind, Daniel in the third year of the reign of Belshazzar is operating in some degree of obscurity. He no longer has this place of prominence. If kings have changed hands, he's been sort of pushed to the back room, but he's still busy about the king's business, and God is still using him. And that's a good lesson for you and I. Whether we're at the front or the back, whether we're at the head or the tail, be busy about our Father's business. Now, Alistair Begg said this, and I think it's very important as we tie all this together. Very helpful. Quote, Daniel 8 is not given so we can mark our calendars. It's given to bring us comfort, even in the midst of trials, troubles, and tribulation. Close quote. His point is, this whole chapter is given to remind us that God is sovereign. He's in control. He's working things out according to his will and his way. So we may see things that make us sick in this world. I promise you, the day is coming when the Son of Man will right all these wrongs. So I present unto you Daniel chapter 8. So forgive me, this should be Jesus in Daniel 8. So just forgive the typo. But I love ending these lessons on Jesus and faith lessons. So where's Jesus in Daniel chapter 8? Well, just like the little horn was broken without hands, all antichrists are broken without hands, and the final man of sin, son of perdition, antichrist, will be broken without hands, even if they puff their chest out to the prince of princes for a short period here on earth, God will humble them. The Lord said to my Lord, Yahweh said to Adonai, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. You see, every rebel will be humbled at the feet of Christ. He's been given a name that's above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow, of things in heaven, things in earth, things under the earth, and every tongue will confess that he is Lord to the glory of God the Father. It is guaranteed. They can confess it now, or for these little antichrists, for these fallen angels, for all of these things, they will confess it on their way to hell, but they will confess it. Now, in the Sunday school class, it came up just briefly about the abomination that makes desolate, the abomination of desolation. Again, we talked about what that was historically, but what's interesting is Jesus picks this up as he's nearing the crucifixion in 33 AD. This is recorded by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He picks up this abomination of desolation, which had already happened in the past, and he cast it to his, at least forward of 33 AD, sometime future to 33 AD. Again, we see that the abomination of desolation would be a dual fulfillment prophecy. Jesus picked it up, it had already been fulfilled, and he reinvigorates it and recapitulates it into his future sometime after 33 AD. So I'll read you the Matthew 24 account, but I would encourage you, in your own studies, read the Mark 13 account and the Luke 21 account and tell me what abomination of desolation Jesus was talking about, because it's crystal clear when you bring all three together. Okay, so reading from Matthew, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So a literal fulfillment, Jesus picks it back up and casts it into the future. As we think about faith lessons or lessons about faith, number one, persecution does not mean necessarily that we are outside the will of God, that we're doing something wrong. In fact, the Bible is clear, it's through much tribulation that we enter the kingdom of heaven. So the presence of tribulation does not mean you're in sin. They hated Jesus, they will hate us. Now, if we are enduring persecution, we should ensure there's no sin in our life. But once we've inspected ourselves, because we don't want to be reprobate, but once we've ensured that we've placed faith in Christ and we're doing our best to walk with Him in the details of life, then we recognize that we're being persecuted because we are true reflectors of His light and His glory. So persecution is not a mark that we're doing something wrong. It could be a mark that we're very close to Christ. But always, do that self-inspection. Number two, God is not only the revelator, the revealer of truth, but He's the illuminator. And we see that with Daniel here in Daniel chapter 8. He revealed the truth, but then He had to illuminate the truth. And that's true for you and I. We have the closed revelation, all the way from Genesis to the Revelation. We have everything that God has to say to us. God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spoke in time past by the fathers, hath in these last days spoken unto us by His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the worlds. Hebrews 1. And so now we need no additional revelation, but we often need illumination. And we can pray to God for that illumination, because God is the one who not only reveals, but illuminates. Number next, God's ways are not our ways. We would have done this a different way. I would have done it a different way. And here's what I would tell you. When we cannot understand His hand, so as we look at this story and we see the suffering of the Jews, it becomes hard to understand sometimes what God is doing. But we have to trust His heart. So when we cannot understand His will and His hand, trust His heart, for He's working all things together for our good if we love Him. And we're called according to His purposes. So when you can't understand His hand, trust His heart. Number next, as you think about life lessons, be faithful even in obscurity. Don't just be faithful when you have the limelight. Don't just be faithful when you have the big show. Don't just be faithful when you have 100,000 people following you. Be faithful when no one's following you. Be faithful when no one's watching, because God's watching and you're His child. And then I'm reminded we never grow too old in our service to God. Daniel's an old man here. He's going to be an even older man next week. And we're going to see he's still getting visions. He's still being used by God. And so I would encourage us, regardless of our age, to run with patience the race that is set before us. Hebrews 12, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. We need to keep running. We've talked about this in Sunday school a couple of times, but it comes up here in Daniel. It's going to see it next week. Regardless of age, run until your chest hits the tape. When does your chest hit the tape? When you die, when you become cognitively unable to do anything due to the world we live in and the fall of man and sin, or when the Lord takes you home. As long as you're mentally alert, as long as you have your mental faculties to some degree, be about your Father's business until He comes to get you. So next week, we're done with Daniel 8. Next week, Daniel 9, we'll do it in 2 lessons. We're first going to have the amazing prayer and response in Daniel 9, and then we're going to have the 490-year prophecy. So God bless you until I see you again in Sunday school or here on YouTube, whichever case. Stay in the Word, keep growing in Christ. God bless you.